welcome and aloha. My name is Mark Shklov. I am the host of ThinkTech Hawaii's Law Across the Sea program. Today we're going to go across the sea to Singapore and talk with Suresh Divyanathan. Suresh is an outstanding lawyer with the law firm of Un and Bazul, LLP, in Singapore. He's also a good friend of mine. And I'd like to welcome Suresh. Good morning in Singapore. Suresh,
hi, good morning.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Mark.
It's good to see you, even during these strange times and at a distance and on kind of a video link. Usually we meet every year in person at the Inter-Pacific Bar Association annual meeting, convention, and this year it was scheduled for Shanghai, and obviously for reasons we all know too well, was canceled. So I wanted to get a kind of an update on what's happening in Singapore from you. Before we go too much into that, although I do want to cover that, briefly tell me, a little bit about yourself, where you were born, raised, where you went to school, became a lawyer, and the type of law practice you have, and want to just get a little bio on you first.
Sure. So I'm born and raised in Singapore. My father is South Indian by ethnicity. My mother is South Chinese. They both grew up in Singapore. They met in Singapore, and started a family in Singapore. I went to law school at the National University of Singapore, and I've only ever practiced law in Singapore. But as you know, Singapore is an extremely small island, so a lot of Singaporeans travel overseas for vacations, and a lot of Singapore lawyers do a lot of international work because Singapore is a huge trading port.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple things that interest me. The diversity of Singapore comes up in your own life here, and also the international nature of Singapore. And when I've been to Singapore several times, it seems like it's part of Asia, but it's also not part of Asia. I mean, what can you explain that to me? I mean, am I on the right track? And what's the diversity like in Singapore? So those two things. It's just an interesting place.
Well, I'll start with the diversity question first. So Singaporeans are generally made up of three large ethnic groups. The first is the Chinese. There are about 70+% Chinese in Singapore. And then the second group is Malay people from neighboring Malaysia, ethnic local people from neighboring Malaysia. That makes up about 14% of the population. Then you have about 7% who are South Indians. And then after that, you have a whole mix of other people. They are about less than 1% for each other category. So those are the three big racial mixes in Singapore. And when you have that, then you have a very diverse religious mix as well. Most of the Chinese are Buddhists or Taoists. The Malays are Muslims, obviously. And the South Indians are mostly Hindu, but some are Christians as well. So you have all these ethnic and religious mix in Singapore pretty much from the start. Singapore is an artificial construct. It was founded by the British and started as a trading post 200 years ago, 201 years ago to be exact, in 1819. And so it was only when the British started it as a trading post, then we had people coming to Singapore. So everybody in Singapore, they can only trace their roots, as far back as 100+ years. That's it. There was originally a small fishing village in Singapore, but nobody can trace their roots back to those people. So everybody came to Singapore, and Singapore always started in that sense as a multi-religious and multicultural society. So that's always been very normal for Singapore. It was always like that. And as far as Singapore being part of Asia and not being part of Asia, well, Singapore is in Asia, so obviously it's a part of Asia, and all the races and cultures are Asian races and cultures. So that's very much part of Asia as well. But because Singapore was founded as a British colony, and so everybody was taught to speak English, all our laws are derived from English law. So in that sense, it's also has a very westernized view of things. It's a very meritocratic society. It's doing well economically and has been since independence in 1965. So the prevailing belief is that everybody can have a good life in Singapore if you study hard and if you work hard. You will be able to succeed in Singapore. There's a lot less about where you come from or where your family comes from and things like that. It's a lot. You can succeed on your own hard work. And yeah, sorry, go ahead.
It seems like everybody gets along. Is that an accurate statement? And also, I mean, I gotta ask you this question. There is a movie that went out, Crazy Rich Asians, talked about Singapore, and everybody loved the movie, thought it was great. In the United States, I wonder what's the reaction in Singapore to the movie, and is it an accurate description of what goes on in Singapore?
Singaporeans love that movie as well. It is a relatively accurate description of the top maybe 0.1% of Singaporeans. So all the shots in the movie that say that this is Singapore, all of that is actually shot in Singapore. So Singaporeans recognize all the landmarks, all the streets, all that sort of thing. The interactions between the characters, the differences in ideas between the generations, that's also very recognizable for us. The two parts of the movie that are not Singapore. One is the bachelor party and the bachelorette party. Those are completely overblown, very, very exaggerated. So there is no partying on a I think it was a container ship located in the sea in Singapore. That has never happened as far as I'm aware. And the girls going to an island, yes, that does happen. Going to an offshore island, an island in Malaysia or Thailand nearby, they do that. But it doesn't start with the bachelorette buying everybody expensive shopping spree and things like that. So that's overdone. The second part, interestingly enough, is the house. The family house is not actually a house in Singapore. That's a house in Malaysia, a house or a boutique hotel, I'm not sure. Singapore has large houses, but nothing of that size anymore. Any house of those gigantic proportions, Singapore is very land scarce, so those would have been sold off and rebuilt into many, many smaller, more reasonable houses for more families.
I see. Okay, all right. So what is the situation in Singapore right now? What is going on under the COVID-19 pandemic? How is Singapore reacting? What's going on? I'd like to get started on that, and then we'll take a break and come back and follow up. But what's going on?
Sure. So Singapore started with actually very few cases in late January and through February. Towards the end of February, we suddenly realized that there was a big problem in one particular segment of people in Singapore, and that's the migrant construction worker community. Singapore is an extremely urbanized island. There are about 5.5 million people on the island. And Singapore has the third highest per capita GDP in the world. So people are generally well off, which means that no Singaporeans want to do construction labor jobs. And so the only way buildings get built in Singapore is if we have migrant workers coming from India, or near countries nearby like Thailand and Indonesia, that sort of thing. They come to Singapore on a contract for a few years, and they work for construction companies, and they do the construction work in Singapore. It's fairly similar to Dubai. Dubai also has a local population that is doing fairly well economically and would not do these jobs. So there's that group of people, migrant worker community in Singapore, and they largely live in dormitories. Dormitories are of very good standard, but it is still living very close together. It's double beds, and it's a large room, and you may have like 10 double beds, so 20 of them live together, shared bathing facilities and toilet facilities. So they're in contact a lot. And the problem is we had a huge coronavirus spike amongst that group. At its worst in March, there were about 500 or more cases a day from the construction worker community. But the local spread in Singapore, the rest of the people, Singaporeans and expatriates working in Singapore who don't live in the dormitories, the maximum number of cases we had there was maybe 30 or 20 per day. So there was huge disparity there. But even so, we decided to do a lockdown, a quarantine in Singapore, and we did that for about 2 months. And then we reopened offices. That's phase one. And now we're in phase two, where we reopened restaurants, but limited seating.
Okay, I want to follow up a little bit on the question about the migrants and the social relationships there. We've had some problems here in the United States you may have heard about. But first, I would like to take a break. We'll be back in 1 minute and talk a little bit more. I want to dive a little bit deeper into this migrant construction worker community and what that means also.
Aloha, I'm Krista Stadler, the host of Nonprofits Mean Business 2 on ThinkTech Hawaii. Nonprofits Mean Business 2 investigates the operational challenges and costs related to managing nonprofit organizations, while encouraging our viewers to find a nonprofit organization that you're passionate about in our community. We are streamed live on ThinkTech Hawaii bi-weekly at 12 p.m. on Thursdays. Thank you so much for watching our show. We look forward to seeing you then. Mahalo.
Welcome back to Law Across the Sea. I'm Mark Shklov, the host, with Suresh Divyanathan in Singapore. And Suresh, you're a good friend of mine and an excellent lawyer in Singapore. But I want to dive a little back into this, what you brought up. There's a migrant community, and there's a couple things going on in the United States that you may have heard about. I mean, we've had some racial tension and protests here. I guess I want to ask you, has there been any reaction to that in Singapore? And then I also want to ask you, I mean, what is is there social tension in Singapore between these groups that you mentioned? I mean, you have a migrant group of workers, and then you also have the local folks. And it sounds like there is a discrepancy perhaps between the social and economic in that country, in Singapore, as well as the United States. What thoughts do you have about that?
Yeah, so in Singapore, amongst the local people, although they come from different races, there is generally very little tension between the races, and part of the reason for that is because we've done a lot in Singapore to try to make sure everybody's integrated, everybody lives and works together, and everybody gets along. So an example of that is that about 80+% of Singaporeans live in government-built apartments. And there's actually an unofficial kind of quota that each apartment block must have a certain mix of races, local Singaporeans in them, so that people live next to each other and people get to know each other. So we don't build communities where one racial group lives all by themselves to the exclusion of everybody else and doesn't participate in the ordinary cultures of other people. You hear about things like that sometimes in certain European cities where certain migrant communities they may have passports from that European country, but they can go their whole lives without ever learning that language. Because they live within that little social bubble. That's never allowed in Singapore. People of different races live together. They go to the shops together downstairs. They eat at the nearby restaurants together. They see each other all the time. All the kids have to go to the same school, and so the children learn to mix with different races from the very beginning. And we even have something called a racial harmony day once a year, where the elementary school kids, if you're Chinese, you have to come to school wearing the clothes from another race, Malay clothes or Indian clothes. And the kids love that because that's a costume party. It's like Halloween, right? Everybody gets to play dress up. But you can't dress up from somebody from your own culture. So that forces the parents to get to know each other. The parents then, Indian parents then have to get to know the parents of some Chinese kid and say, hey, we can exchange clothes. We'll dress your kid up, you dress our kid up, and then the parents get to know each other. So sometimes to understand someone, you have to walk a mile in their shoes, and maybe it starts by wearing their clothes for one day a year in elementary school for the 6 years you're in elementary school. So we do a lot of these kinds of little things to help everybody integrate. So as far as the local population in Singapore is concerned, there's generally very high level of integration and religious tolerance and cultural appreciation for each other. There might occasionally be somebody saying something stupid on Facebook or on Instagram, but then they get into a lot of trouble with the comments they get, and then they apologize and they learn a lesson from that. But by and large, everybody gets along. The migrant worker community is different, however, because they're not Singaporeans. They are foreigners who come to Singapore on a work permit, and they work for a few years. So they don't interact that much with the local population. They have families back home. They're in Singapore really to earn money and to send the money back home to their families. So a lot of them are very focused on that. They see Singapore only as a place to earn money. So if you give them an opportunity, many of them will work 7 days a week because they get paid by the hour, and they just want to spend all their time while they're in Singapore, making as much money as they can and sending back to their families in India or elsewhere. And they live in dormitories because that's going to be the most affordable way for them to have housing. They do have their days off, and they can roam freely in Singapore. They can do what they want, but they generally stick amongst their own group. So they don't interact so much with local Singaporeans, but there really isn't any kind of tension with them. They appreciate having the opportunity to work in Singapore and make money, and they're treated fairly. So there's no issue with that. Where the coronavirus has brought this into sharper focus is because of close proximity in which they are all living, and so the spread of coronavirus was very fast, which was very unfortunate. But one of the things that makes Singaporeans very proud is that when this happened, the Prime Minister of Singapore did an address on TV to the nation saying that these people are our responsibility as well. They were asked to come to Singapore and given work permits to work, and this virus has spread through their community. And he said specifically, we will care for them. We will look after them. And that's precisely what we've done. So those who have needed medical attention have gotten it. The very few cases that have needed intensive care units have been given that, and they haven't had to pay anything for it. So they're treated exactly like Singaporeans when it comes to the medical care required for coronavirus. Singapore has an extremely low fatality rate when it comes to coronavirus. The rate is about 0.1%. And that's partly because Singapore is an extremely developed society and high technology society. So medical facilities, medical care is very good in Singapore.
Well, that sounds pretty good. It's an interesting comparison to the United States. Has there been any reaction? I guess I got two questions. Has there been any reaction about what's going on in the United States with race issues in Singapore? And secondly, has there been any reaction against China because of COVID-19 in Singapore?
There hasn't been a large reaction either way. When you talk to local Singaporeans, they generally agree that there is an unacceptable level of police violence in the United States, and it appears to, at least to some extent, be racially directed. But it's not something we can relate to in Singapore because we don't have that in Singapore. Singapore has very little violent crime. I just looked it up, and we average about 10 murders a year, the entire country. So that's less than one a month. And so if anybody dies in police custody, well, so that means, anytime there's a murder, it's front page news. So if anybody dies in police custody, that immediately comes into sharp focus. Because there are just so few murders to begin with, so few homicides to begin with. So we don't have that issue with the police. We have a kidnapping on average once every 10 years for something like the last 40 years. So if there's a kidnapping, that is huge news. So it's very, very low crime, at least physical crime in Singapore. So we don't have too much difficulty with the police force in Singapore in terms of the way the police force interacts with people in Singapore.
How about the reaction to China? Has there been any negative reaction in that respect?
There hasn't in terms of anything overt or anything organized, but generally, there's some level of dismay that coronavirus has come out of China. There's some level of concern, about hygiene standards in China and the kind of things that people eat. And to be fair, Singaporeans love eating all sorts of food as well. But over time, we've stopped eating some of the more exotic animals. But generally, there's a feeling that as China gets richer, as people earn more money in China, they will adopt more of an international standard in their way of life, and hopefully we don't get these problems going forward. Hopefully, but we really don't know.
So it's kind of as I hear you saying with respect to China, it's kind of a wait and see and give them some space. And as to the United States, comparing yourselves Singapore to the U.S., that's you feel we have a long way to go too. Although I don't, it is perhaps not voiced as much in Singapore about the United States either. You're in a way a neutral country, and you view these things and you move on and you try to do the best you can. Is that an accurate way of phrasing the Singapore lifestyle and philosophy?
Yes, pretty much. And the thing to remember is that Singapore is an extremely small island, so it's really just one city. Everybody lives in that one city. So what that means is that it's actually quite easy for everybody to have the same view. We don't have a large rural-urban divide. There is no rural. There is no farming in Singapore. Singapore's #1 agricultural export is orchids and ornamental flower. That's grown using hydroponics. So it's grown in pipes that go up and down in a very urban factory setting. So there's no farmland in Singapore. So when you think about the diversity of views that you have in America, we don't have that, because it would be the same as saying what the people in Honolulu think. Well, everybody in Honolulu will think in one way because they all live in one city. And that could be very different, from people living in and doing farming, in Alabama, Louisiana, or other places like that. So Singapore is just one city, and that's why it's easier to have a common view about things.
Seems to be a cohesive type of environment there that you have. Now we have a minute left, and I'd like you to tell me, how are we going to get through all this? I want the answers, Suresh. What can we do? What can we do to survive and thrive and succeed in the new normal, whatever that is? What's your feelings? What are your thoughts?
I think some things are going to be changed permanently. I think the reality is that coronavirus is going to be with us for a long time, at least until a vaccine is found. But even when a vaccine is found, that vaccine is, we're going to be able to vaccinate people in rich countries a lot faster than people in poorer countries. So we will, the belief is that coronavirus will be with us for quite a number of years. And so living with that means that there'll be a lot more Zoom meetings. Shaking hands and hugging is going to fall out of favor. Safety distancing is going to continue to be the norm. I think a lot of tourist traveling between countries there's going to be very little of that for a long time to come. And even when it does happen, it's going to happen in bilateral agreements between countries that have largely solved the coronavirus problem. It won't be a free-for-all anymore. So the idea of being able to backpack across Asia for 2 months across numerous countries, that's not going to happen anymore. And Singapore has a large tourism sector, and so that's going to be badly affected. We have far too many shopping malls and hotels for local people, so they're going to go through some serious restructuring. International conferences, the type that you and I go to every year, Mark, that's going to be tough. Put 500 to 1,000 lawyers from all over the world together for a week. And I don't know whether that's going to be feasible going forward, at least for some time. We're in for some serious changes in the world.
Well, Suresh, I want to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and talking about Singapore and what we're going through now. It's very helpful to have these international exchanges and discussions, and I appreciate you very much, my friend. And I look forward to the next time that we are able to get together. So aloha, as we say in Hawaii, and I will look forward to our next meeting.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, and we are through with Law Across the Sea. I'll see you in 2 weeks. Aloha.